Chapter 2. At the turn of 12th century, the quaint little town of Almora in what was then the United Provinces was still pristine, unblemished by the strides of colonial modernity that had influenced other similar towns in the Himalayas, those particularly neighboring Nainital. Well known as a center for cultural practice and reformist zeal, Almora was also had a deep and ancient spiritual heritage. This is evident from the temples that adorn this Himalayan town, the most prominent being the nine mandirs dedicated to the worship of the Devi, eight to Bhairavnath, a manifestation of Lord Shiva, and the Katarmal Surya temple, which is one of the famous sun temples of India. The spiritual energy of this town was further churned by the visits of enlightened souls. Swami Vivekananda wrote that after his return from Chicago and subsequent travels, his mind yearned for solitude, peace, and quiet. It was then that he came to Almora, where he had the highest meditative experience. Nearly 4 decades later, in 1928, Monica Devi, the wife of Gyanendranath Chakravarti, the vice chancellor of Lucknow University, became an ascetic and founded the Mirtola ashram 8 kilometers from Almora. She rose to be another spiritual luminary in the region by the name of Yashodama and was eventually joined by her mystic disciple Swami Krishna Prem, formerly Ronald Henry Nixon, who had been a fighter pilot in the First World War. In 1937, Ma Anandamayi came to Almora en route to Mount Kailash and said of this place, I see that sadhus in astral bodies with matted hair are coming from within the ground and moving away. This proves that this is a place of penance. Perhaps this was the pull that brought various sadhus and mahatmas to Almora through the ages. One day, in the mid 1930s, the locals who were bustling around a bazaar in Almora were taken by surprise when a tall figure clad in a blanket and dhoti suddenly appeared at a grocery store owned by Sri Pyarelal Shah. What they didn't know was that Sri Shah's 7-year-old daughter, little Siddhi, who spent most of her free time there, was the one that Baba had come to bless. In time, she would grow to be Neem Karoli's Baba's prime disciple. According to the Hindu belief system, the role of Guru is paramount in a seeker's life. The Guru and disciple are bound by a deep spiritual bond which transcends the cycle of birth and death and carries on from one life to the next. It is believed that when great masters incarnate, they bring with them their past disciples, and a moment of divine transmission, the soul bond of many lives is rekindled. Perhaps this is what happened when Maharajji blessed Ma on that day, and the flame was lit within. After this, Ma returned to the usual rhythm of her life. Maharajji wandered away into the mountains. It was in the early 1940s when Baba Maharaj appeared on the horizon of Nainital again. He ushered in a devotional wave of Hanuman Bhakti, and the hills of Kumaon began to reverberate with the chanting of Hanuman Chalisa and the Tulsi Ramayana, particularly the Sundarkand, which relates to how Hanumanji went to Lanka in search of Mahasita. In the years that followed, temples and ashrams in Hanumangarh, Kainchi, Bhumyadar, and Kakdi Ghat came up, and soon Maharaji became the spiritual father figure of almost every household in the region. Sri Siddhi Ma was born in 1928 in Almora on the 10th day of the Chaitra Navratri to Sri Shah and Srimati Revati Devi. It is believed that the Shahs had originally been the treasurers of the Chand dynasty, which had shifted its capital to Almora in 1563. According to Ma's horoscope, the date of birth was 31st March. At her Namkaran ceremony on the 11th day, she was given the name Haripriya, but her father called her Siddhi. The favorite child of her father amongst 7 sisters, she loved spending time with him and helped in the shop after school hours. Even after many years, Ma would remember the colorful, foil wrapped chocolates displayed in glass jars, which sometimes her father gave to her as a special treat. The family, while not affluent, never wanted for anything, and a feeling of deep contentment prevailed in the household. The Shahs lived in a traditional house in Khazanchi Mohalla, a narrow, low roofed building with a cluster of rooms, fairly small in size, with a beautiful carved wooden facade in those days. These Kamauni houses were constructed with locally sourced material, including wood, stone, and cow dung, and were plastered with mud. The sloping roof was made in four layers with logs of pine, mud, and slate tiles. The ground floor had a cowshed with a low ceiling and small windows, which also served as storage for firewood. It was built in a sustainable way that insulated the entire structure, keeping it warm in the long winters. Ma reminisced in her later years that because of the warmth, the barn would be her chosen place to play when she was a child on cold winter evenings. There was no electricity, so they used kerosene lanterns and oil wick lamps in the evenings. The one great luxury was a tap that provided running water. As a child, her hair braided neatly. Ma wore a pahadi pajama, a shirt, and cotton topi, and was often taken for a little boy. In those days, it was customary in the hills for the little girls to be dressed often like little boys, in small coats and woolen trousers to keep them warm. 3 decades later, in the ashram in Kenchi, Maharaji would smilingly remind Ma about the clothes she'd worn when he first saw her. Ma's day at home would begin with a bath, after which all the children were supposed to write Ram Ram in their wooden slates. The previous night they would have polished the slates and kept them ready. Now they wrote the Lord's name with pens made of reeds that were dipped in chalk solution before writing. The sisters would compete with one another to establish who wrote best. After this, they would joyfully recite the Hanuman Chalisa and take a sip of Ganga Jal, and only after this they would eat breakfast and run to school. After classes were over for the day, Ma would rush to her father's shop. Late afternoon, when the shops in the bazaar would close, their patios served as playroom for the children of the neighborhood. Her maternal grandfather had a go down for quilts and mattresses, which served as a perfect spot for hide and seek. At other times, she would play tapu or hopscotch with the other children in the cobbled streets. Another game Ma excelled at was gitte, played with 5 small pieces of stone that were expertly tossed in the air and picked up from the ground in different permutations and combinations. Barely 8 years of age, her daily evening routine was to go to the nearby temples in time for the evening aarti. Her little friend Lakshmi would join her in the narrow passage just below the house, and secretly the two would hold hands and go from temple to ring bells and bring prasad for their mothers. The prasad was usually a few sugar crystals or 1 or 2 small pieces of coconut. At home, too, there was a small niche in the wall in which Ma had kept a picture of Sri Radha and Sri Krishna. It was a passion with her to decorate this little altar. When flower sellers came to their streets, Ma would run down to them and buy flowers. In fact, sweet peas, what she called matar wale phool, remained her favorite, and every year she would wait for their season. Ma's favorite temple was the Raghunath Mandir of Almora, a deeply spiritual spot where Swami Vivekananda is also said to have meditated. She would tiptoe in and, evading the eye of the priest, sit on the lap of Lord Ganesha. While narrating this story to me, माँ would smile and say, मैं कितनी छोटी रही होंगी जो गणेश की गोदी में बैठ जाती थी? How small must I have been to be able to sit in Ganesh ji's lap? It is interesting to note that Siddhi is also the name of one of the wives of Ganesh ji. The Uttaryani fair is generally held in the second week of January every year on Makar Sankranti, and in Kumaon, the most famous one was held in Bhageshwar on the banks of Saryu River. Ma remembered going to the Mela with her uncle. A part of journey was by bus, a part on foot, all their wares loaded out into a mule. Sometimes Ma's little feet would get tired, so her uncle would hire another mule for her to ride on. Even though a child, Ma would help her uncle out as he traded his wares. On the first day of Chaitra came the festival of Phooldehi. The little girls of the neighborhood would get together and pick the fresh blooms of rhododendrons. Ma particularly enjoyed this ritual. They would go from door to door in a group and shower these flowers and a few grains of rice on the threshold of each house in the neighborhood, invoking auspiciousness upon the household. In return, the children would get rice, pieces of jaggery, and blessings. By the time Ma was 10 or 11, she would lead a group of children and enact a performance of the Ram Leela or Krishna Leela during the holidays. The venue would be either the courtyard of the Murli Manohar temple or an open space at the back of the house where she lived. Ma was usually the director of the play, but sometimes, being taller than the other children of her age, she would enact the role of Sri Rama or Sri Krishna. During the periods of drought, the elders would gather the children and ask them to pray for rain. Under the leadership of our little Ma, her playmates, both Hindu and Muslim children, would form a group and march up and down the street in the bazaar. They would look up at the sky and loudly chant, Allah Mia Pani de Gurdani de, Pani gaya khet mein, Roti gayi pet mein. Allah give us rain, rain will water the fields, we will get food to eat and also sweet treats. In time, it would rain. Down the hill from Ma's house was a modest hut with a slate roof. Here lived an old woman, Kaushalya. She had a cow and sold milk to make a small living. Ma's affection for the old lady whom she called Kaushalya Amma were perhaps a result of born from another life. Once, while driving through Almora, Ma pointed to a slope in Dharanola and told me that she would go there with Kaushalya Amma to help her cut grass for her cow and collect wood for her stove. Amma would cook food for herself on a wood fire, and before eating, she would save a portion of it for Ma. On her way back from school, Ma would run down to the hut and eat the food kept for her there. Rice and wheat were unaffordable luxuries for Amma, so it was usually coarse hill grains like Madira and Madua. The rotis would be eaten with milk or curd. Often, Ma would also stay the night in Amma's hut. The bedding was just two coarse black blankets, one to spread on the mud floor and the other to use as a cover. This turned into a preference for coarse black blankets that lasted Ma a lifetime. In later years, when Ma was visiting her mother in Almora, one day she got an urgent message to return to Nainital. It was a Saturday, considered very inauspicious day for undertaking a journey, but such was the seriousness of the summons that Ma was compelled to leave. When Kaushalya Amma came to know that Ma had to leave Almora on a Saturday, she was convinced in her heart that some great misfortune had befallen Ma. Unable to bear the agony of this, she left her body the same day. In 1990, when Ma went on a pilgrimage to Gaya, she herself performed the Shrad for Kaushalya Amma on the banks of Phalgu river. In this, she transcended the norms of her spiritual life to perform this ritual, since Kaushalya Amma had no one of her own to do it for her. It was customary in those days for brides to maintain. In the year 1944, at the age of 16, Ma was married to Sri Tularam Shah, a well-known advocate from Nainital. His large joint family lived in Tallital at the time. One morning, the word spread that Maharaji was visiting the house of Sri Ram Shah, a local businessman. The ladies in Ma's family decided to go for his darshan. Ma went with them. It was customary in those days for brides to maintain a certain restraint in their behavior, and perhaps it was for this reason that Ma sat at the very back of the hall. Baba was surrounded by a large group of devotees. Seeing Ma, he pointed his finger towards her and gestured for her to come forward. Ma came up close and offered pranam. Maharaji immediately went on to give a vivid account of Ma's silent sadhana to the gathering, the constant flow of Ram's name with each breath she took, her high meditative state, and how she lived her life in the world like a lotus in water, yet above the water. Then he made the prophetic statement loud enough for all to hear that he would make a kuti for her in Vrindavan. Considering this to be a foreboding of renunciation, of leaving this worldly life for a higher spiritual calling, thoughts of uncertainty regarding Ma's future crossed the mind of elders who were present there. Shortly after, in 1947, the India Hotel was established by the family and they changed their residence to Geeta Bhavan, a house which was located just above the hotel. Very soon, Geeta Bhavan became a venue for spiritual gatherings among the ladies of Nainital. Continuous chanting of the Ramayana, celebrations on Krishna Janmashtami, Kirtan on every Puran Masi, full moon day, and the daily ritual of Aarti in her small temple every morning and evening, it all added to the devotional hue of Nainital. Around this time, Ma also began to attend spiritual discourses given by Haridas Baba, Anandamayi Ma, Swami Vidyanand Ji, and other renowned saints who visited Nainital. In time, it became a practice for all devotees going to Kailash Mansarovar to commence their holy pilgrimage by first going for Ma's darshan. They would partake of the prasad offered to them at Gita Bhavan, and Ma would thoughtfully provide the pilgrims with blankets, warm woolen sweaters, and other requisites for the hazardous journey. With the building of the Hanumangarh temple in Manoraha Hill in 1952, Maharajji's visit to Nainital became more frequent. In those years, on some days he would give darshan to Ma at Gita Bhavan. When he was in Hanumangarh, Ma would walk the 2 kilometers to the temple every day. Since Ma had household responsibilities, she would leave home as early as 2 a.m. in order to receive his darshan at dawn. Maharajji would be sitting on his takhat in his small kuti atop the hill, wrapped in a blanket with one or two devotees. A kerosene lantern would be burning in the corner. Often Maharajji would ask Ma to sing a bhajan. Ma had a deep, sonorous voice. Baba's two favorite bhajans, she told me, were Ho Nirvarkar Tat Pahapi Tum. Repeat. Often Maharajji would ask Ma to sing a bhajan. Ma had a deep, sonorous voice. Baba's two favorite bhajans, she told me, were O Nirvarkar Tathapi Tum and Sumiran Karle Mere Man. All the while she sat there and sang with her eyes closed. Tears flowed from Maharajji's eyes. Over the years, Ma's family went with Maharajji on pilgrimages to various shrines and temples in India. Rameshwaram, Jagannath Puri, Badrinath, Balaji Tirupati, Prayag, and so on. Usually, arrangements were made for their stay in dharamsalas. For instance, I remember Ma telling me that they would stay in the Dudwali Dharamsala in Puri or the Sindhi Dharamsala in Chennai. In 1962, Tularam ji passed away. A year later, Ma, accompanied by Jivanti Mataji, began to live in the ashram at Kainchi. Maharajji had first visited Kainchi with Ma in the early 1960s. At the time, it was so densely forested that sunlight would not filter through the foliage and reach the ground. The villagers were afraid to go there even in the daytime because of wild animals, mainly leopards, porcupines, and barking deer. The Shipra River flowed past the forest, and on the other banks there were a few modest houses with slate roofs made of stone and plastered with clay. One day, Maharajji was returning to Nainital from Ranikhet accompanied by Ma. There had been a bereavement in Ma's family. On the way, Maharajji told the driver to stop the jeep on the main road. Ma helped him cross the river and they entered the forest on the other side. There was a huge rock under an uttis tree. Maharajji said he would remain there sitting on the rock and asked Ma to proceed to Nainital. On her way back to the vehicle, Ma asked a local man the name of this place. He replied Kainchi. That was her first initiation to the place that was to become her spiritual sanctuary for decades. The rock where Maharajji sat that day is known as Maharajji's Shila. It is a place of prayer for all of us. The river in Kainchi incidentally flows northwards, something which is regarded as auspicious and was given the name Uttarvahini Ganga by Maharajji. Perhaps the reason for Baba to select Kainchi was that the place had been sanctified by many saints who had lived and meditated there in earlier years. Somwar Giri Baba, an enlightened sage, would invariably make a stop in a rock cave in Kainchi on his way to Padampuri or Kakri Ghat. This small cave located behind the Hanuman temple in Ashram has been preserved as it was. On clearing the land, the Havan Kund, where Somwar Giri Baba performed oblations in the fire, was also found. In the early 1950s, a sage known as Kamlagiri Baba lived here too and organized readings of Shiva Purana and the Devi Bhagavata. Another name often mentioned in this context is that of Premi Baba, who used to live in a hut in Kainchi village. To the east of Kainchi is the towering Gargachal range, and it takes its name from Garga Rishi, preceptor of Sri Krishna, who is said to have performed spiritual austerities here. Years later, when I had begun to live in Kainchi myself, on some sunny days, Ma would draw my attention to a length of saffron or white cloth fluttering away on the peaks of Gargachal, vivid against the blue skies, clearly at an elevation where there was no human habitation. Sometimes at night, we would see a huge beam of light radiating down from the mountain top. While performing Arati in Maharaji's kuti in the ashram, Ma would tell me to offer Arati to this hill as well, where she said many Siddhas still lived.